Hola, ¿qué tal? Mi amo Mr. Azzopardi. Sorry, no, this isn't for the Spanish class, is it? Hi, Year 12, it's Mr. Azzopardi. This is a class, a lesson about the ontological argument. Today I'm going to look at Descartes' development of the ontological argument. Rene Descartes, French philosopher, one of the most famous philosophers of all time. So far we've done the original ontological argument from Anselm, the criticisms from Guanillo and from Aquinas. We also did response to those criticisms, particularly looking at how you can use the second form of the ontological argument from Anselm to respond to Guanillo. So we haven't really got as far as what I think is the best criticism of the ontological argument, and that is from Kant. And the reason we're going to go through Descartes first is because Kant is primarily responding to Descartes' argument. So you need to understand the way in which Descartes phrases things to understand Kant's argument. But Kant's argument does work for Anselm, can be used to criticize Anselm too. Really, Descartes doesn't really, I don't think, add to the argument very much. It's just that he phrases it in a slightly different way. And it's also quite interesting why he uses this argument. So he has a particular reason for wanting to use the ontological argument to prove God's existence. He doesn't want to use any of the other arguments. Now, we are going to go through a bit of Descartes' basic philosophy, which you may have covered with Mr. Ward in when you did about mind, body and soul. So when you did about dualism, I don't know, because there's different things you can cover and different ways you can cover that course. So I don't know if you've done a bit of Descartes in there. Okay, let's start from the beginning with who he is, Descartes. Well, Descartes said this: I think, therefore I am. That's what he is most famous for. And if we did a class on this, we'd probably have a lot of discussion about what this means. What does he mean? I think, therefore I am. I'll go into that in a minute. But that's his most famous phrase. Cogito ergo sum is the Latin. I think, therefore I am. So Rene Descartes lived from 1596 to 1650. He said as his argument in his book Meditations. Meditations is what his book is called. Now, meditations doesn't mean meditation in the Buddhist sense of the word. It means kind of thinking things through. So the idea in Descartes, like in his book Meditations, he pictures himself sitting in front of a fire, thinking things through, pondering the nature of existence, trying to work out what's true and what we can know. One of the first things is his idea cogito ergo sum. I might post a video. There's quite a few good YouTube clips about this cogito ergo sum stuff. So if you want to look at it in more detail, I can post some below this video. So cogito ergo sum means I think, therefore I am. So what Descartes did was a little bit like Plato, I suppose. He was someone who was kind of doubting the world around him, doubting the validity of the world around him. And his idea was this. He said, well, how do I know anything around me is true? How do I know I can even trust my senses? If I'm trying to work out what's true and what's not true, let's just see, well, what can I doubt? What can I not be sure of? And he said, well, I can't even be sure that everything around me is true. It might be that I'm being deceived. His famous thought was, what if there's an evil demon somehow controlling my mind to make me think that all the things around me are true when they're not true? Now, that might seem unlikely, but the point is you can't be sure that it's not true. You can't be sure of it. So he said, let's doubt everything that it's possible to doubt. Let's put everything we think we know, including the evidence from our senses, the idea that we can see around us and the stuff we see as true. Let's put that into the bin of doubt. Just say we can't believe that. What can we know for sure? Well, he said there's only one thing we can know for sure, and that's that we exist. The reason he thought that was because he thought, well, if I can doubt everything around me, I can doubt all my senses. I could even start to doubt whether I exist. But if I start to doubt whether I exist, the point is there's someone doubting that, and so I must exist. There's someone doing all this doubting. So he says this is what we can be sure of. We can be sure that we do exist. All the other people in the world might not exist. All the things around us might not exist, but we definitely exist, because if there's someone doubting everything, then that person must exist. So this is where Descartes begins. That's his kind of his first thing that he can be sure of. He kind of what he does is kind of wipes away all the knowledge he has and then tries to build it up in a way that is certain. You know, he kind of takes away everything that is just common sense to us and just says, yeah, but what can we be certain of? And he says, well, the first thing we can be certain of is that we exist. So here's a little bit more. Like Plato, Descartes was suspicious of trusting the evidence of our senses to tell us the truth. How can we tell the world we perceive through our senses is real? Perhaps we are being deceived by an evil demon. That's Descartes' ideas. My way of phrasing it, a more modern way, is perhaps we have no body and just brains in jars. You know, maybe we're just a brain in a jar, and people are putting electrodes or something in the jar and making us think certain things. If you've ever seen the film The Matrix, well, the idea of the Matrix is that we are all people. We're not. The world around us is not real. We are actually being plugged into this thing called the Matrix, and to find out the real world, you have to unplug yourself. Interesting film, very philosophical. So Descartes says, perhaps this is true. Perhaps when all the things around us are not true. But he sees a way out of the problem. We've said that he says we know we exist, and he says if we could prove that there is a God who is a perfect being, then we could trust that we can believe our senses again. Because he would say if there is a God would never allow us to be so deceived that everything is an illusion. God, who's a perfect being, would guarantee that we can trust our senses. He wouldn't deceive us. He could guarantee the existence of God, could guarantee there is no evil being or evil demon fooling us. So we've got to believe in a God, he says, to believe in our senses, because only a God, a perfect being like God, could guarantee that the stuff from our senses is true. Now, the difficulty that Descartes has here is that he cannot then prove that God exists using a posteriori, or called inductive methods. So in other words, he can't use evidence from the senses. Sorry, he can't use that God exists using a posteriori inductive methods. So that means he can't use evidence from the senses to believe in God. Why can't he do that? Well, we've just said he wants to believe in God so that the fact that God exists will guarantee that our senses are trustworthy. If that's true, then we can't start by proving God using our senses, because we'd end up in a loop when we say, well, why do you believe in, you'd end up saying something like this, why do you believe in God? Because we've got evidence from our senses. Or why do you believe in the evidence from our senses? Because we believe in God, and God would guarantee our senses are reliable. But why do you believe in God? Well, because our senses tell us so. But why do you believe in your senses? Well, because God guarantees our senses are true. And it just goes round and round in a loop. The point is, if you're using God to guarantee that your senses are reliable, then you can't use your senses to guarantee that God exists. You end up trapped in that loop. You've got to find evidence that God exists from outside your senses, and then you can start to trust your senses on the basis that God exists, and God will guarantee that your senses are reliable. So that means he must find an a priori deductive proof of God's existence. And the only a priori proof of God's existence is the ontological argument. The only proof of God's existence that isn't based on using empirical evidence is the ontological argument. So that means that all the arguments like, religious experiences or teleological argument, cosmological argument, they're all based on a posteriori knowledge, on evidence, and therefore Descartes can't use them, so he can only use the ontological argument. So here's his ontological argument. Descartes begins by defining God as a supremely perfect being. So his definition is similar to Anselm's, but slightly different. A supremely perfect being. And he argued that we all have a clear idea of this being in our minds. That's maybe debatable, but that's what he says. He says everyone has a clear idea of what that means, a supremely perfect being. From here, he tries to prove God's existence. So the idea of God that we all have is a supremely perfect being. Because God is a supremely perfect being, he must possess all perfections. So he is a being that has all perfect qualities. So, traditionally that includes things like being omnipotent or powerful and omnibenevolent or loving. He then goes on to say existence is a perfection. It is more perfect to exist than not exist. Therefore, God must possess this quality. Therefore, God exists because existence is a defining predicate of the concept of God. So in other words, he's basically just saying Like we saw with the Anselm argument, he's saying existing is better than not existing. If we have the example of like a bag of money, is it better to have one that exists or not exists? Well, it's better to have one that exists. So therefore, existence is more perfect than not existence. So that means something that's completely perfect must have that particular quality. It must have all the qualities of being a perfect being. So one quality is it's omnipotent, another is it's omnibenevolent, and another is that it must exist. Therefore, and I've put this in bold, God exists because existence is a defining predicate of the concept of God. That's an important term. A defining predicate is something which tells you the definition of what something is. So, for example, if you'd say, like, what's a triangle? Well, a defining predicate of a triangle is it has 3 sides. Another defining predicate of a triangle is it has 3 corners. Another defining predicate, the angles all up to 180 degrees. Now, all of those things are defining things. They are the things that make something what it is. He is saying, well, defining predicates of God include that he's all-powerful, that he's all-loving, and that he must exist. And so therefore, he says God must exist because it's part of the definition of who he is to exist. So there's similar. It's very similar to Anselm's argument. It's just phrased in a slightly different way. Just to talk through this and give it a bit more explanation. So we could talk about objects and their necessary attributes as characteristics, or what we've called defining predicates. There are some things a thing must have to be that thing. That's a very badly worded sentence, but I can't think any way else to say it. So a triangle must have 3 sides. To be a triangle, it has to have 3 sides. So it's part of the definition of the thing. Bachelors must be unmarried. If someone's married, they're not a bachelor. A mountain must have a valley. This is true because a valley is just the bit at the bottom of the mountain. So if there is a mountain, there must be a valley. In the same way, what's the typo there? But in the same way, God must exist. So it's part of his definition to exist. It's impossible to think of a triangle without 3 sides. And in the same way, it's impossible to think of a God that does not exist. So that's part of the definition. Now, just Descartes knew he would be challenged, and this is one of the challenges he might say. Someone might say, yes, it's true, we cannot think of a mountain without thinking of a valley. There has to be, if there's a mountain going up, there must be a bit at the bottom. But this does not mean the mountain and the valley we are thinking of actually exist. They might say, look, we can, just because a triangle must have 3 sides, that doesn't mean that triangle exists. It might be that, it could be that we have a world with no triangles. So the point they're making there is, yes, things have defining predicates, but just because they're defining predicates, that doesn't mean those things exist. However, what Descartes is saying is that God is different from other things. It is not an essential part of the nature of mountains to exist. What's essential for mountains is if they do exist, they have a valley. So if there is a mountain, it has a valley. However, what he's saying is that if for God, not only as being, that God must be all-powerful and all-loving, he also must exist. It's actually part of his nature to exist. Whereas with triangles, with valleys, in fact, with all of the things, because he's the only perfect being, nothing else has that defining predicate. Nothing else has that defining predicate as they must exist. So as a perfect being, God must exist, according to Descartes. Now, this is quite similar to Anselm's second argument. So let's just talk about how that be similar. So as it is part of the definition of God that he exists, God must exist. B definition? Mr. As a party, very poor. As is part of the definition of God that he exists, God must exist by definition. It is not possible for God to not exist, just as it is not possible for a triangle not to have 3 sides. So God must exist, a triangle must have 3 sides. Objects in the world, such as islands, and I've said that islands on purpose, as we'll see, do not have existence as part of their definition. Therefore, the ontological argument only applies to God, the perfect being, and cannot be applied to things like islands. And then I've put, take that, Guanillo. So in other words, you can use this, like Anselm's second argument, to criticise Guanillo, because what he's saying is only God has existence as a defining predicate. Nothing else in the world has existence as a defining predicate of what it is. Yes, there are other things that exist, but it's only God that has it as one of the defining predicates of that category of thing. So, like an island, yes, an island may exist or it may not exist, but that's not a defining predicate. The defining predicates are whatever, that it's a landmass surrounded by sea. That is an island. and it might exist, it might not exist. But God is a being who is like all-powerful, all-loving, but he's also a being that must exist by his own very nature. That's his argument. And that is basically Descartes' argument. Very similar to what Anselm has to say, but this is what I would like you to do with this. Is I want you to, I'll put the slides up, make any notes you need from this video, but then I want you to write out an explanation of why Descartes, two things really. One, why does Descartes want to prove the existence of God? In fact, three things. Let's go for three things. Why does he want to prove the existence of God? Why does he, in his philosophy, why is it so important that God exists? Secondly, why can he only use the ontological argument? Why can't he use any a posteriori arguments to prove the existence of God? Why can he only use the ontological argument? And what is his ontological argument? Why does he think God must exist? Those are the three things I would like you in your notes to explain. I hope that makes sense. Oh, there's another slide. I didn't know there was another slide. Okay, so this is the last bit of his argument. To deny the existence of God is like saying this existing thing does not exist, which is clearly ridiculous. So he's got that's what he's basically trying to say. God is a thing that exists. That's part of his definition. If you say that God doesn't exist, you are saying this thing that exists doesn't exist, which is ridiculous. All other a priori arguments to establish the existence of things, like perfect islands, tries to establish the existence of contingent objects, therefore fail, because there's nothing apart from God that has existing in its definition. Only an absolute perfect being can have existence as a defining predicate. So there's a little bit more explanation. Sorry about that. Yeah, just go through these three things I want you to have then. One, why does Descartes want to prove the existence of God? Why is it so important to his philosophy? You know, link it to this idea that he wants to be able to believe in his senses. Why can't he use any other proofs apart from the ontological argument? And what is his ontological argument? Okay, I hope it makes sense. Bye.